Hey everybody, we're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Erin.
I'm Dr. Kristen.
And we are here with our final installation of Danish Heritage Month for the month of December, which we just decided to do because Dr. Kristen is in fact very Danish. And if you watched like hereditary wise, like very Danish, but also like culturally, like in her bones. If you watched our last video on finding hygge, Dr. Kristen is like peak Danish. But the other thing that is peak Danish is the documentary we're talking about today, which is on the YouTubes, free to watch, called Noma, My Perfect Storm. We should say at the beginning, there is a big ol' language warning for this. There's a whole lot of the F-bombs throughout the whole thing. These people do not hold back and they swear a lot. So if that is not your jam, don't watch it. But it follows the story of René Redzepi, who is a Macedonian immigrant to Copenhagen, who is a chef and founds this restaurant Noma, which for 3 years in a row, then they lost and then they won again in the 2010s, was voted the world's best restaurant. And so it is the story of kind of creating this Nordic cuisine that he is famous for. And through the work at Noma, it's a lot about culture, it's a lot about food, it's a lot about community, it's a little bit about racism and being an immigrant to a very white country. There's a whole heck of a lot of things that happen. It's an hour and a half long. It probably should have been 2 30-minute documentaries, because the parts about it that are really Danish are the really slow camera zoom shots of mushrooms and wistful action shots of root vegetables and people foraging. So it's a very slow watch, but it was fascinating. And like René as a character was fascinating. And we just have a couple quick thoughts about what we thought we got out of this documentary.
So first of all, I love the idea that the Nordic cuisine, which if you read anything about Noma or about René or about Claude Kelly, who was his business partner, the whole thing is that in the 80s and 90s, there was not Nordic cuisine.
Yeah.
And even into the early O's. Denmark was very famous for actually figuring out how to export really quickly. So even before Ireland kind of figured out their national butter and could send Kerrygold everywhere, Denmark figured that out and sent Lurpak everywhere and sent Danish ham everywhere. And it became very common for people outside of Denmark to get better quality Danish food than people inside Denmark.
Right.
And things became very, very nationalized and very structured and the same. So to come along and say we're going to make a Nordic cuisine, and René talks about this in the documentary a little, what made them the laughing stock of everything, because Danes were not interested in eating. They were interested in hospitality, perhaps. They were interested in sustaining life of food. They were too pragmatic for eating out. You're being ridiculous.
Yeah, and like that gets covered a little bit in the Finding Hygge documentary as well, and they talk about that like food wasn't, like going out to eat wasn't really a part of hygge until recently.
Yeah, and it's still not a part of hygge for a whole lot of people. Right. And so the evolving, but if they were going to create something Nordic, it had to be a relationship with the land and with time. Mm-hmm. Because when you live, and we said this in Finding Hygge, when you live in a country in which the sun is only around occasionally in some parts of the year, you become really, really attuned to the fact that you can't manipulate time. Mm-hmm. And what does that look like? And how do we do that? And what is foraging and kind of all of that? So Nordic cuisine is really based on that. It's that by the food you put in your mouth, you know where you are in the world and what time of year it is. Yeah. And like there are things that grow year round in Denmark, dill being one of them, which is, my husband jokes that I'm Danish because I could be made of dill. It is my favorite spice. I will put it on anything that it's appropriate with. I love it. I love pickled herring.
You're so bloody Danish.
I'm so bloody Danish. I love salmon and dill. I love frikadella. I love it all. But like meat and fish and the foraged mushrooms and things like that. So it's a lot about that and that foundation and the kind of cultural we don't even talk about hygge, but it's so part of us. Like you can hear so much hygge to me in what René is saying, but he doesn't ever identify it as such.
Right. He never says, he doesn't name it, but it's in like everything he does in his business, I think.
Everything.
Yeah.
And the thing I would like to talk about the most right now, especially because we're about to transition into Immigrant Awareness Month after you watch this video. So this is a really good hinge point.
Almost like we planned it, which, spoiler alert, we didn't, but it looks great.
René is a Macedonian immigrant, and we discuss, and I will say he presents white because a lot of Macedonian people present white and are white and all of these things. People have very specific stereotypes about Macedonians that whenever I read them, I'm like, you've never met.
Yeah, and specifically like his family, he doesn't say whether he's practicing, but his family is Muslim as well.
Yeah. And so he talks specifically about what it's like to be an immigrant in Denmark and be a Muslim in Denmark and be different in Denmark and have not a Danish name and kind of what does that look like. And it's very, a couple of his friends are like, yeah, it obviously really affects him. But I just want to pause here because it doesn't really unpack what that means. So Denmark didn't have immigrants for a long time. This was the case for a lot of European countries. There weren't really like documented migration in the way that it was. And when Denmark was building itself after it lost a bunch of land to Germany, was all really, when it was building its culture, was all in the 1880s, when massive migration of humans wasn't quite part of how Europe functioned, mostly because people didn't have the money to leave where they lived. It just like, you didn't leave where you lived. And that was designed a lot around being born Danish and having your roots there. And so there are cultural schools created and a whole lot of things in which we perpetuate what Danish is. And it's mostly focused on people who were born there. They haven't really figured out how to marry people that were born there and the people that come there. And how do you become Danish when you aren't born there? I joke that it's the same as Texas. Texans can't figure this out either. How do you become a Texan if you're not born in Texas? But in Denmark, it's a really serious thing. Difference is only beginning to be celebrated in some places. The idea of Danish is still very homogenous. The idea of what it means to be Danish is still very homogenous. We're not saying anything that Danish people themselves don't say. This is the dark side of hygge, as we talked about last week, is that to be Danish is not to be Muslim. To be Danish is not to be a person of color. To be Danish is not to be born somewhere else. And there are many, many, many Danish activists and humans and just normal living people who don't want this to be true and are actively working to expand the idea of what it means to be Danish. But I remember having a conversation with somebody at the University of Copenhagen when I was there for a conference once. And I said, like, well, if I traded in my Danish citizenship, my American citizenship, and became a Danish citizen and learned Danish, like my last name is Nielsen. My name is Kristen Nielsen, for crying out loud. It's like really, really Danish. And I love this. I would be Danish, right? And he just started laughing. He goes, no, you were born in Maryland. You'll never be truly Danish. And he wasn't trying to be mean.
No, be honest.
You're just being honest. And so I figure if I, who present lots of tick boxes as to what being Danish could be, would still be treated like that, I can't imagine other immigrant groups and what that looks like.
Yeah. And I think what's so fascinating, and we've talked about we talked about this recently in our Hottish Take on the Children of Shame documentary that was done by outsiders about mother and baby homes in Ireland. But like the power of an outsider, right? Like the irony that the person who invented Danish cuisine in this modern sense, because cuisine wasn't a part of it, like thinking about, and so they were all like, but that's not being Danish. So nobody who was Danish had really done the work that René comes in and does as an outsider. And the irony that like the best restaurant in Denmark with the essence of Danish cuisine is entirely conceived by a man who was born in Macedonia. I loved that as part of the story. And like, just that idea that like, sometimes when you are that outsider, you can help grow a culture or change a culture or expand your idea of what it means to be something by having outsiders' perspectives. And you know, he talks really openly about the continual racism that he faced and faces But I would hope that like he's one of those things that like he's walking so that other people can fly, maybe.
And this documentary is about 5 years old,
Yeah.
and was a kind of a and filmed several years before it came out in terms of like the dates they talk about. So it would be really fascinating to have a more recent conversation. But Denmark's real big push now is to be carbon neutral as a country, and Copenhagen specifically as a city. And so every single social campaign I see at all is about that. And so it's an interesting conversation too of like, what can a country focus on? Like, how many national messages can you have?
Yeah. Yeah. And in Finding Hygge, we talked about like the Syrian refugee crisis, which was at its peak really in 2016, and how that impacted Denmark. But we don't know really what the status of their immigration looks like in the last few years and whether that has changed. But
yeah, because all I could give on that is I've asked my family members, but it's all anecdotal, and they're all from one very specific part of Denmark, and so that's not at all, germane to this conversation.
Yeah.
But I love how proud the Danes are and how much they love their language. I really, really wish every once in a while that Google Translate button would be a little bit more accurate. Because I really love to read some Danish news and get a feel, but I can't, and that's okay. Yeah, that's their choice.
But I think so much of the idea, just to kind of wrap up on this and connecting it really to what we learned in Finding Hygge, like one of my favorite things that René talked about was like the way he talked to his staff at the restaurant. And specifically, like they go through this norovirus scandal and it really knocks them down, and they lose best restaurant of the year after 3 years in a row, and like a lot of change and disruption in their work culture, which really kind of forced him to reckon with like, what are we trying to do here and what is important. And like he, at one point I think the Michelin stars might have been coming out or something was getting announced, and he's having a team meeting and he says, are we happy in our work? Are we full all the time? Then like, and he, uses the F word because that's René, and he was just like, then F all that other stuff. Are we happy in our work? Are we full all the time? And that is like, from what I have now learned in the last month, the most Danish thing. And something we should all really strive for. Like,
yeah. I hope that you've enjoyed this very Amerocentric journey into my heritage. And if you're watching this, and as always, we've said at the end of every video, if you've got other resources for us or other thoughts, it's hard to find books about Danish culture in English, but I've certainly read as many as I can, always looking to read more. And we'd love more videos. We'd love more documentaries. We'd love more all of that. Obviously, we can watch Borgen and The Bridge and all of the Scandi noir, but we'd love stories that don't involve death.
Yeah.
So just as a
thanks.
Death or politics. I love this little country so much, and I can't wait to take Erin there and to take you all with us via our video cameras, because we will definitely be live filming as much as we can as we traipse around the country,
Yes.
which we will do after these times.
Yes, and we decided offline before filming this that we will not be eating at Noma. We are both adventurous eaters. Dr. Kristen is a super foodie and a bit more of an adventurous eater than me, but I'll like try anything once. But we're not that adventurous. Thankfully, we have learned via the Google that René is opening a burger joint this month, literally. And so that has gone on the list for when we are in Copenhagen sometime. But we will go pay homage to Noma and like probably take a selfie outside and be really excited. But I don't want to eat moss. I'm sorry.
It doesn't sound appetizing for the prices that I would be asked to pay for.
I was about to say, for what we would be asked to pay for that, hard pass.
Yeah, I don't often eat at like the super high Michelin star places.
Yeah.
I've certainly eaten at Michelin star places. Belfast had a couple that were totally wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
And I've certainly eaten at some in London and New York and Philly, but it's not something I seek out because they tend to reward spectacle in ways I don't value.
Yes, and the portions are so small.
I'm hungry.
So small. I'm hungry. If I'm paying like exorbitant costs for food,
I don't want to have to go to McDonald's on the way home.
I would, yeah, preach. And we've had to do that.
You got to do that.
We had to do that, folks. Yeah. So all God's children, if you've been to Noma and you had a wonderful time, we'd love
to hear about it.
Love to hear about your stories. We won't be going there. But that's a wrap on our Danish Heritage Month. As the non-Dane of this dynamic duo, I had a fantastic time. So I hope you guys did too, enjoying our discovery of Danish heritage and culture. As Dr. Kristen said, next up is Immigrant Awareness Month, which we are also making up because technically Immigrant Awareness Month is in June, as I discovered yesterday. It's not going to be a happy month, y'all, because as we learned in this documentary, immigrants are treated horribly all over the world. But we're going to try and talk about not just immigration to America, but what migrating people look like all around the world. And we found some really interesting and diverse perspectives on immigration, asylum seekers, refugees, and we're going to try and include all of those. So we will see you all for that in the new year.
See you then.
Bye.